I'm someone who's trained and trains others in something called the adult attachment interview. Anybody coming in, often there is some biggish pot around relationship challenges, either in terms of early relationships with parents or ongoing difficulties either with romantic relationships, either starting them, holding them, finishing them in some way. So from that side, it is easy to use an attachment framework to help understand what's going on. And what this interview does is it opens it up and it puts on display where some of those pockets are. And it's because of that that I think it can save a huge amount of time in a psychotherapeutic treatment, because you're getting to some crux of the matter that otherwise you might be waiting for. It might come up, it might not come up. Our whole way of regulating feelings and thoughts is anchored in this attachment system. Can the child, or later the individual, turn to someone in times of distress? That being kind of the bottom line. If our attachment systems are satisfied, we're free to explore the environment. So that's why we see even within ourselves, if somebody close to us is sick, or there's a separation or a loss, really hard for us to concentrate on the usual things. And then we see that in children as well. You know, kids in foster care across the board often do very poorly, say, in some of the schooling that they have, even though we know that they're very, very bright. The attachment system has compromised their exploration system, right? Because the first step is survival, and that's what the attachment system can then offer. You first get some kind of orientation to the individual's childhood experience, where they grew up, who was around, did they have much contact with grandparents, so some kind of warming up scenario. And then a question that is meant to be somewhat unusual, which is to give me 5 adjectives or words that describe your earliest relationship, first with mother. You give the person a minute to think about them, and then you ask them why they chose the ones they did. And so what we're looking for here is very important in terms of the fit between the kind of overall semantic organization of one's thoughts and feelings with the episodes. So someone puts out there, it was warm, loving, protective, and then you say, okay, Elliot, when you described your earliest relationship with your mother as being one in which there was protection, or your mother was protective, do any memories or specific incidents come to mind? And for the individual who can't discern or just hears that, oh, this guy had a really loving mother, what we're looking for is something more specific. How was she protective towards you individually as the child? Is there, you know, I don't know, I came home from school and she always had my favorite snack ready. We used to sit down together and talk about, you know, friends or my homework, as compared to someone else who might say, oh, I used to go to the bottom of the garden and we had a shed there and I used to sit there and, you know, figure things out on my own. And then there's a special question, which really surprises the unconscious, which goes like this. When you're upset as a child, what would you do? So again, we're looking for a fit. If you gave us these glowing adjectives and then when you're upset, you're on your own, or talk to the dog, that's a mismatch. That if it really was as warm and loving, you're going to need some evidence for what you say. So the other hallmark of the whole interview is around coherence. Does your story feel believable? So we're not looking for pure fluency. Disfluencies happen to all of us in our speech, but they're often very telling where it is. Usually it's on the positive, right? Because they're wanting to paint a picture that sits very much better within them. You protect then the parent or the caregiver from that, because at some level you still need them. And it's too painful to then go to that place. So I must have done something wrong. I must have, you know, seduced them, and that's why there was sexual abuse going on. Or I provoked them. You know, any parent would do that if they had a child like me behaving in that way. But someone else could say mean and say, well, that's just how they were, and write them off in a very dismissing way. So both of those are high defenses. So the individual who chooses or says, I don't remember, is telling us something really important, right? So it could be that they really, really don't remember. They're not just saying they don't remember. They have the experience of like, nothing's coming up for me. But most often, from what we know about the way we work as humans, that's a defensive maneuver. Somewhere along the line, something happened. so that it made sense for that individual to conserve their energy or to protect themselves from painful feelings by not remembering. And often those people, do fairly well in our society, but that is a dismissing, right? They're dismissing some important aspect of their experience. And at some level, that costs you in terms of flexibility, for example, in terms of affect or feeling states, because you are partitioning or cutting off the full range. And that's where we get the mental ill health coming from. So the individual who says they don't remember, it might work for them. They might actually be a high enough functioning person in our society. But we would think that through a therapeutic treatment or intervention, we could expose or broaden their capacity. So we'll tell you something like, when you're upset as a child, what would you do? They often refer to the crying and the difficult behavior, and then often bring it to the present. Oh, and last week it was my birthday, and my mother couldn't even get it together to have any kind of celebration for me. She always does everything for my sister. And the anger, you see it in the words, as compared to the dismissing, which is minimizing the affect. So the resistant, anxious child looks quite angry, and it's kind of maximizing of affect. It's all out there. Often when they're most distressed, the parent is least likely to be able to be available to them and to help them with that distress. But they do it enough that it gives the kid hope. The child who gets classified as avoidant, and they tend to have a parent who is dismissing. They're not here for me. I'm on my own. I'll take care of myself. So in terms of, again, if we go to defense mechanisms, so the avoidant child in the strained situation, parent leaves, they tend not to cry. And when parent comes back, they often crawl to the other side of the room to look for a toy and make it look like, I'm not bothered by the separation. But we know physiologically that if we take, say, a sample of their cortisol, it's high, right? So by 9 months, it's quite an amazing thing. By 9 months to 12 months of age, these babies have already learned how to show one thing on the outside, and yet internally a very different set of experiences, right? Like, it's just not worth me displaying my distress. And then we also ask about losses, we ask about separation, and abuse, both physical and sexual, because we can't rate the degree to which someone's resolved any of those issues unless we know that they really happened. The piece that comes into the adult attachment interview that I think has, some of the most powerful therapeutic, the tool set, or gives us the most, are the two questions that are aimed at delivering something around reflective functioning. So one of them is, why do you think your parents behaved as they did during your childhood? And the second one is, do you think your childhood experiences have had a role to play in your adult personality? We're not looking for Pollyannish, leave it to beaver kinds of families. We're looking for the person to be able to think and tell us about those experiences in a way that's coherent. So some of the most compelling, the highest reflective functioning scores we get are for those individuals who've suffered adversity, because it's kind of like that irritant in a pearl. There was something they needed to do to figure out relationships, and then they can demonstrate that they've done that. So one of the newish areas that our Center for Attachment Research at the new school has been going, you stand people in front of a mirror, you video film their responses, and you ask them what they see. Do you like what you're looking at? Do you like what you're wearing? If your mother was standing here, what would she say? If your father was standing here, what would he say? Do you feel the way you think about your body is influenced by mother, by father? So a whole set of questions. And we're looking importantly at both the verbal, the content, but the nonverbal as well. How they hold their body, facial expression, all of those parameters. And we did that alongside the adult attachment interview in our first study. If you were securely attached, you had a better representation of your body, you were more coherent, you had more positive representations for both mother and father, and a better overall body esteem. If you were avoidant, or in our dismissing classification for the adult attachment interview, your mirror interview conveyed that as well, and often quite superficial, not a lot of reflective functioning going on, and often an attempt to kind of live up to the ideals in our kind of cultural media society. Also the same if you were preoccupied, angry in terms of the adult attachment interview, or unresolved. Then we took those individuals and we put their toddler girls in front of the mirror. The first study was with just female toddlers, and we found a really interesting connection. If the mother was securely attached, the baby was able to look at their own image and look away. If the mother was dismissing on the adult attachment interview, the baby did not want to look at their own image. And if the mother was classified as preoccupied on the adult attachment interview or unresolved with regard to loss or trauma, the baby couldn't stop looking, as if they were looking for something in that image to connect with. You know, the attachment interactions, you know, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, build something that then gets internalized, both in terms of expectations about relationships, but parts of the body that also take on some aspects of those relationships. We get people, for example, who say, yes, you know, my mother always, you know, encouraged me to be physical and, you know, complimented my body. And they're standing there like this, holding themselves, right? So we're looking at that interplay between, you know, what they say and other aspects. The whole field, I think, is beginning to take more of an appreciation to the way in which we represent our bodies and in connection to mental health and attachment. I think the piece with the body and how the clinicians move in treatment and how that blends with the verbal piece is going to be a huge kind of new opening. We're doing a little bit of work on that by coding clinicians' body.
What do you think? Any hints of anything? I know it's probably too early. But
Well, I think there's something around the coalescing. When there's coherence in what they say with how they're moving, it goes a long way. I think whatever interpretation you might have, if you do it in a way that your body is supporting whatever that message is, it goes way further. Neutrality conveys, I'm not that interested, right, as compared to tracking and, you know, rupture and repairs, right, because it teaches us what we need to do to bring the person back close to us. But I think the neutral face often can convey you're not interested. And so you need an open enough stance that invites the person to meet you somewhere where you are, right? Something you've said has created a reaction in me. So I think the pure poker face isn't going to go very well, or the too animated, right? You know, or the because I think sometimes then it feels like, oh, I shocked you with that, or you know that was too much for you to absorb. I will refrain then from expressing, you know, that deep piece. And then there's the other side of the continuum. Do you laugh, or how hard do you laugh with a patient who's very funny?
So poker face is just dumb.
Is just a bad idea. But and our classical psychoanalysts started with that as the blank slate, right? That only onto that canvas can the patient express themselves. And I think now we know that that's not true. You need some kind of back and forth, co-created, shared experience for this all to work. So I think that's one of the messages in our work, is how much is there to be gained from using some of these assessments in clinical contexts and then developing a therapeutic technique based on them. So I think what you would be doing in a therapeutic intervention is trying to get the person to put themselves, for example, in their parents' shoes and think about the thoughts, feelings, and intentions that they had when they were parenting you. And from there, that going over the ground, that level of exploration, I think you can help promote reflective functioning. And whether some memories then start to come back or not, who knows? But the orientation to future relationships or current relationships in that particular way is where the therapeutic action is. Maybe it all went this way because of that, or maybe because of this, or what were the possibilities? And now when I'm having, say, conflict with my partner or spouse or boss even, or child, are any of those themes, are the patterns that the person is describing, are they now reappearing? And I think that's the value of why reflective functioning is so powerful. It's also linked to our pattern searching and our pattern describing. So if you have a patient who, say, is quite dismissing, right? And often can't see, one sees this a lot, can't see their role in these difficult relationships that they're having either at home or at work, right? So they got to, someone they're working with, is crazy, and it's always, the other person. So somewhere to get them to be a little bit curious. You got to do it delicately, because they will easily feel threatened that you are blaming them for the difficulties in the relationship. So it's going slow, but some are like, oh, that's really interesting. You talk about this colleague as, always being late with deadlines, and that drives you crazy. Or they're always dumping work onto your plate, and then you're feeling resentful. Is there anything in maybe the way you're asking them to do this task, or the way that they've asked you to do a task? Is there something in the way that they hear you, or when that might be important to us? Or is there something that sounds a bit to maybe what was like for you as a child, in terms of when your parents asked you to do something? Yeah, we could do this assessment, and we could, even, share with the individual, this is what we've learned. That in and of itself is not therapeutic, to share just your coding sheet. There's something about learning how to be in that relationship, and for the person then to practice this at home to some degree, in terms of, can you pick up like, oh, that's what we talked about in therapy. I tend to do this when my partner asks something of me that, makes me angry, or I feel that welling up inside. What could that be connected to? And then take it to your session the next day and say, this is what happened. And I think there's something so powerful of being with someone as you talk it through, and putting words to feelings is the other part of the antidote for this. And going over that ground over and over again, and experiencing something in the moment that I think creates the change, right? There's this big, huge furor around now with mental health, and how do we deliver better mental health in schools or in our community? What's the fix? I think the fix is relationships. That goes back. We are social animals, and so enhancing someone's capacity to either understand their previous relationships, as well as form better relationships now that provide some support, and also where they can provide support. So that kind of reciprocity. The individual who has a really tough time in forming relationships or keeping relationships is not an easy venture to bring right, but that's what the challenge of a therapeutic modality. So I think there's a lot of work for us in terms of movement and where we might go, because we're also within our psychodynamic framework under siege, given how big the problem around mental health is right now in 2022. So how many people are we really going to reach with our individual treatment modalities? So we developed this group attachment intervention, trying to get at a group. But the onslaught of all of these digital interventions are, we're going to have to do something with. Do we say, well, okay, maybe we join forces and at least infuse them with our psychodynamic understanding, so that at least there's some of that, rather than sitting in our ivory tower and saying, no, we don't do that. We only do individual work, certain frequency a week, and don't go out and say to the community. So I think that's the risk. We could do that, but we're not going to be here for very long if we do that. And maybe that's what we're destined for, very kind of pessimistic. Or do we open the doors and set up free clinics and really get to a much wider range of individuals for whom the 3 times a week is not going to work? But what are the rudiments? What are the essence of what we think of in a psychodynamic framework that we could take to a bigger audience? I think right now, there's so many places that we could go. So for example, curriculum in schools that promote empathy or have an anti-bullying kind of component, which is what, infusing empathy all across the curriculum could go very, very far, rather than just the cognitive test-taking piece. Or, you mentioned earlier Hans Panskept, who was a huge proponent of play, right? Unstructured play, not all of the kind of structured, soccer and piano and whatever, but just giving children an opportunity to just be and explore, which is a way of practicing some of the things that they will need later on. but for all of us to be in that kind of more playful, pretend kind of mode. At no time of life are we impermeable to experiences that could change our attachment. So that's good or bad, right? So for those of us who might have had the benefit of a secure attachment context early on, bad things could happen, could topple you, or the business that we're in, which is the change business, people who had challenging early histories, that we feel there's always a potential for writing that. And as human beings, we have this amazing self-writing capacity, right? We're always gearing towards getting more on that, whatever that normative, typical trajectory is.